The morning mist clung to the towering cliffs of Yosemite Valley, drifting lazily over the emerald canopy of pine and sequoia. 5 friends, each with a sense of adventure burning brightly within them, had set out at dawn, backpacks strapped tight, boots laced and maps folded neatly into their pockets. They had always been drawn to the untamed wilderness, the kind of beauty that demanded respect and rewarded courage. And Yosemite, with its jagged cliffs and whispering forests, seemed the perfect backdrop for their expedition. There was Lucas, the unofficial leader, a tall, wiry man whose calm demeanor often masked a relentless curiosity. Beside him was Mia, a photographer with an eye for the sublime, always pausing to frame a shot, her camera hanging from her neck like a trusted companion. Then came Ethan, the jokester of the group, whose laughter echoed like a bright flare through the otherwise serene air. Next was Sophia, quiet but observant, cataloging the minutiae of nature in a small journal she carried everywhere. Lastly, there was Jordan, strong and dependable, the one who often carried the heaviest loads and kept an ever-watchful eye on the terrain ahead. They moved in rhythm, their footsteps soft against the moss-covered soil, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot seemed louder than it should have been, as if the forest itself were listening. The trail they had chosen was less traveled, a serpentine path that led deeper into the wilderness, past cascading streams that caught the light like liquid crystal, and over ridges that offered glimpses of the valley below, grand and unforgiving. As the sun climbed higher, the friends began to spread out slightly, each absorbed in their own world, the crunch of leaves beneath feet, the murmur of wind through the treetops, the occasional call of a distant hawk. Yet, as familiar as the park seemed from postcards and travel guides, it was a place of hidden depths and sudden turns, where shadows lengthened unpredictably, and trails that once seemed clear could vanish into a thicket of underbrush. By midday, the group reached a small clearing, encircled by granite outcroppings and dappled in sunlight. They paused, not just to rest, but to drink in the stark beauty of the place. Mia raised her camera, capturing Ethan as he leaned against a boulder, grinning at the absurdity of balancing precariously on the edge of the clearing. Sophia scribbled notes furiously, her pen scratching against paper as she documented the patterns of moss and lichen, the direction of the wind, the scent of pine resin mingled with earth. Lucas consulted the map, tracing their route with a finger. The next segment of the trail promised to be more challenging, a narrow ridge that wound along a steep incline, bordered by a sheer drop on one side and dense forest on the other. Jordan checked their supplies, ensuring water bottles were full, ropes were secured, and backpacks were evenly balanced. Everything seemed in order, yet there was a subtle shift in the air, an almost imperceptible tension, like the forest had held its breath, waiting. As they proceeded along the ridge, the scenery transformed. The trees became denser, their canopies forming a green cathedral overhead. Light filtered through in uneven beams, casting elongated shadows that danced with the movement of the wind. The trail narrowed, roots snaking across it like natural barricades, and the friends were forced to navigate carefully. Each step required attention, each handhold a test of trust. The valley below was a distant patchwork of green and stone, beautiful but far enough to remind them how small they truly were in the expanse of the wilderness. Hours passed, and the group fell into a quiet rhythm. They spoke less, conserving energy, attuning themselves to the subtle sounds of the forest. And yet, amidst the beauty, there was an underlying unease. The trails were unfamiliar. Landmarks that had seemed clear on the map were harder to identify, and the sense of direction that had guided them initially began to falter. Lucas called out periodically, making sure no one had strayed too far, but the dense foliage seemed to swallow sound, leaving only fragments of voices drifting back and forth. By late afternoon, they encountered a stream that shimmered like silver under the descending sun. It was shallow enough to cross, but required careful footing. Jordan went first, steady and cautious, testing each rock before stepping fully. One by one, the others followed, the sound of running water masking their movement. Yet as the last person stepped across, a sudden snap, like the breaking of a branch, echoed unexpectedly. For a fleeting moment, the forest fell silent again, as if holding its breath once more. They pressed on, unaware that the shifting shadows and hidden trails were beginning to play their part. Yosemite, majestic and serene on the surface, had depths that few could truly navigate without becoming part of its mystery. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor, the first threads of unease began to weave themselves into the day, a subtle warning that the adventure, so full of wonder, was slowly tipping toward the unknown. As twilight crept over the valley, the air cooled rapidly, and a soft fog began to rise from the forest floor, curling around the bases of the trees like restless spirits. The five friends pressed onward, their senses heightened by the dimming light and the eerie hush that had settled over the trail. Each step seemed louder than the last, the crack of a twig underfoot reverberating through the dense forest as if announcing their presence to something unseen. Lucas led the way, consulting the map under the fading light. What had seemed like a straightforward path earlier now appeared convoluted, with multiple branches that could easily mislead anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. He felt a knot of unease tightening in his chest, but pushed it aside, reminding himself that they were experienced hikers. Yet the sense of direction that had guided them all day now felt unreliable. Landmarks seemed distorted by the low light, and familiar shapes of granite cliffs appeared unfamiliar and menacing. Mia lingered slightly behind, her camera forgotten around her neck, replaced by a growing apprehension. She noticed the unusual silence of the forest, the absence of birdsong, the stillness of what should have been a lively ecosystem. Even Ethan, who usually lightened the mood with his humor, walked with a subdued caution, scanning the shadows as if expecting them to move. Sophia clutched her journal tightly, her eyes darting to every shadow and every strange pattern in the undergrowth, sensing that their journey was taking a darker turn. The path narrowed further, twisting along the edge of a ravine, and the fog thickened, reducing visibility to only a few feet. Jordan, ever the protector, moved closest to the cliffside, ensuring no one slipped. He reached out instinctively when someone stepped on an unstable root, steadying them with a firm grip. The friends whispered reassurances to one another, but their words sounded hollow, swallowed quickly by the dense fog. Suddenly, a distant sound caught their attention, a low, resonant echo, neither human nor animal. They froze, straining to identify it. The sound repeated, a rhythmic vibration that seemed to move through the forest rather than across it. Lucas held up a hand to signal them to stop. His voice, though calm, carried an edge of tension as he murmured, "Stay close." Whatever that is, it's not ordinary. The echo seemed to follow them as they advanced, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind. The friends found themselves glancing nervously over shoulders, unsure whether the sound was a trick of the fog or something more sinister. Mia tried to lift her camera, but her hands trembled too much to focus. Ethan suggested jokingly that it might be an elk, but even he could not mask the fear threading his words. As the sun dipped completely below the horizon, darkness fell in layers, and the forest transformed into a labyrinth of silhouettes and shifting shadows. The five friends became more tightly clustered, their movements cautious and deliberate. Each step required careful observation. Each rock and root became a potential hazard. The trail, which had seemed manageable in daylight, now appeared like a trap, winding deeper into the unknown. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and a sudden realization struck them. They had lost sight of a familiar landmark. Lucas stopped and called out, his voice echoing in the cold night air. The sound returned only in fragments, distorted and uneven. Panic began to prick at the edges of their minds. For the first time, they were confronted with the true scale and unpredictability of the wilderness surrounding them. Yosemite in its vast grandeur was no longer a backdrop for adventure. It was an imposing, living entity, indifferent to their presence, its hidden dangers creeping forward silently. A subtle but undeniable fear settled over the group. Each footstep was measured, each glance over the shoulder weighted with uncertainty. Lucas tried to regain composure, whispering plans and directions, but even he could not hide the creeping tension in his voice. Sophia's journal slipped from her hands as she clutched Jordan's arm, her wide eyes reflecting the fog and shadows like a mirror of the forest's growing menace. Ethan, usually the anchor of levity, moved in silence, his smile gone, replaced by a tight-lipped vigilance. Then, without warning, the fog parted for a brief moment, revealing a jagged rock formation ahead. It was unfamiliar, not marked on their map, and its sheer looming presence seemed to block their path. The friends exchanged nervous glances. Lucas suggested going around, but the undergrowth on the side was dense and treacherous. As they debated, a sudden rustling came from the dense trees to their left, sharp and frantic. Something, or someone, was moving quickly, unseen, and the sound vanished just as suddenly as it had appeared. The group's unity, forged in shared adventure, began to strain under the mounting tension. Uncertainty, fear, and exhaustion became tangible companions, pressing against them more powerfully than the cold night air. The wilderness, magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, had shifted from a source of wonder to a looming test of their resilience. Every step forward was a gamble, every shadow a potential threat, and every sound a question mark in the ever-thickening fog of Yosemite's night. It was here, in the creeping darkness and the mysterious silence, that the first threads of true danger began to weave themselves into the story of the five friends. A danger born not of human intent, but of the park itself, vast, unyielding, and alive with secrets waiting for those who dared to venture too far. Night had fallen completely over Yosemite, and the forest had transformed into a shadowy labyrinth, the trees merging into dark shapes that loomed like silent sentinels. The fog had thickened, curling around trunks and boulders, reducing visibility to mere feet. The five friends pressed forward, their senses heightened, every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves amplified in the oppressive quiet. What had begun as an exhilarating adventure was now slipping into something far more unsettling, and a subtle, creeping dread had settled over the group. Lucas led, his headlamp cutting a narrow beam of light into the inky darkness. He felt the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders, but even his experience with backcountry trails could not completely dispel the rising unease. Behind him, Mia clutched her camera absent-mindedly, no longer focused on capturing beauty, but merely as a talisman against the uncertainty around her. Ethan's usual humor had vanished entirely, replaced by an anxious vigilance. Sophia scribbled notes furiously, though the words seemed less about observation and more a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos of the night. Jordan stayed close to the edge of the trail, hand on his rope, every muscle coiled and ready to react. It started subtly, a snap of a branch that didn't match any of their movements. Then the sound of distant footsteps, irregular and muted, echoing through the fog. Lucas stopped abruptly, signaling the others to halt. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. The forest answered only with silence, dense and thick, almost suffocating. They waited, hearts pounding, straining to catch any sound that might reveal a path back to safety or a warning of what lay ahead. A sudden breeze carried a scent that was foreign, earthy, metallic, and strangely pungent. The friends exchanged nervous glances. "Maybe it's just the wind," Ethan suggested, but even he sounded unsure, and his words hung in the fog like fragile hope. They moved on, slower now, more cautiously, senses sharpened to every minor disturbance. The trail, once familiar in their maps and imagination, had become a maze, twisting and turning unpredictably, with landmarks obscured by darkness and fog. Minutes stretched, and the group felt an invisible pressure constricting the space around them. Suddenly, Mia, walking slightly behind, called out sharply, I think I saw something." She pointed toward a shadow between two ancient pines. Lucas swung his flashlight, but there was nothing, just the fog, the rough bark of trees and the faint glimmer of dew on leaves. Yet the fleeting image had been enough to set nerves on edge. One by one, the friends felt the creeping sensation of being watched, though no eyes met theirs, no footprints marked the ground beyond their own. As they navigated a steep incline, Lucas slipped briefly on moss-covered stone, barely catching himself on a root. The jolt of adrenaline heightened the tension further. Jordan's steady voice called out, "Careful!" But even his reassurance couldn't mask the growing fear in his tone. The path narrowed, forcing them into a single-file line. It was then that Lucas realized something chilling. The familiar rhythm of their group had fractured. He counted heads. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5. Yes, 5. But the line had gaps, subtle yet threatening, as if the forest itself were beginning to separate them, fragment by fragment. A sharp cry suddenly pierced the night. Ethan's voice, startled and panicked. The group froze. Lucas swung his headlamp toward the sound, heart in his throat, and caught a glimpse of Ethan slipping, tumbling down a shallow ravine hidden by fog and undergrowth. Mia screamed, rushing forward, and Sophia and Jordan followed, their hands reaching for Ethan, whose arms flailed as he tried to grab a root. Miraculously, he caught a protruding branch dangling precariously, but the force had been enough to knock him several feet away from the trail. Lucas reached down, gripping Ethan's wrist with a strength born of fear, and pulled him back to solid ground. Their breathing was ragged, hearts pounding, but the relief was fleeting. In the scramble, Mia stumbled backward, disappearing momentarily into the fog before a desperate hand reached out and caught her. Sophia and Jordan clung to each other, trying to maintain cohesion, but the forest seemed intent on fracturing them, every sound and shadow a subtle threat to their unity. It became frighteningly clear they were no longer merely lost. The terrain, the darkness, the fog, and some unseen presence were conspiring to isolate them. The 5 friends, once inseparable, now found themselves disoriented and vulnerable, each step into the night taking them deeper into Yosemite's enigmatic heart. Panic whispered at the edges of their minds, threatening to overtake reason. Lucas tried to impose order, issuing quiet commands to stay together, but the forest's oppressive silence answered with uncertainty and the faintest echoes of movement that were never theirs. And then, as if the night had waited for the precise moment of maximum tension, a sudden sound, a high-pitched, anguished shriek, cut through the fog, startling the friends into freezing. It was not a human scream, nor fully animal, but something in between, raw and echoing unnaturally. The friends clung to one another instinctively, fear tightening its grip. Yosemite, magnificent and serene in daylight, had revealed a darker, almost predatory side, indifferent to the bonds of friendship or the will of those who dared to enter its depths. The forest waited, patient and unyielding, for the next move, for the moment when 5 friends would be forced to confront the full weight of its mystery. The night deepened, wrapping Yosemite in a suffocating blanket of shadow and fog. The forest, once a realm of towering beauty, had transformed into a maze of looming shapes, shifting in the faint glow of headlamps. Each step felt uncertain, every sound magnified into a threat. The 5 friends, once confident and spirited, were now bound together by fear and the shared knowledge that the wilderness around them was vast, unpredictable, and merciless. Lucas tried to lead with clarity, his voice steady despite the panic he could sense in the others. He urged them to remain close, to keep their formation tight, but the terrain was unforgiving. The trail narrowed further, twisting along steep slopes and jagged rocks. Roots and loose stones made footing treacherous, forcing them to move slowly and cautiously. The fog was so thick that even a few feet ahead could not be seen clearly, and the familiar patterns of the forest were obscured, turning every step into a gamble. It began subtly, small separations that went unnoticed at first. Ethan, always slightly ahead, slipped briefly into a shadowed alcove, distracted by a strange reflection of light on a wet rock. Lucas called after him, but the fog swallowed the sound, making it difficult to judge distance. Mia paused to help Ethan regain balance, momentarily losing sight of the others. Sophia, documenting every motion and sound in her journal, lagged slightly behind, absorbed in her writing. Jordan, checking the edges of the trail, found himself stretched thin, trying to keep the group connected while navigating the treacherous path. Minutes passed, and the gaps widened imperceptibly. Voices that had once been clearly audible were now faint, distorted by the mist and the curves of the valley. The forest seemed to conspire with the darkness, shifting perception and creating illusions that led each of them to believe they were closer together than they truly were. Lucas, sensing the subtle drift, called again for cohesion, but the echoes returned, warped and uneven. Anxiety began to take hold, gnawing at their rationality. Suddenly, a low, rasping sound echoed through the trees, a noise that seemed to move with a purpose, circling and retreating at once. The friends froze, straining to pinpoint its origin. Mia clutched Lucas's arm, her breathing rapid, eyes wide with fear. Ethan, who had moments ago joked about the ghosts of Yosemite, fell silent, a pall of unease settling over him. Sophia's pen dropped from her fingers as her attention shifted entirely to the unseen, and Jordan instinctively scanned the perimeter, hand gripping the rope that had become their lifeline. Then it happened. A sudden slip on moss-covered rock caused Ethan to lose his balance, tumbling several feet into the undergrowth. Lucas lunged to catch him, but the fog and uneven terrain made it impossible to reach him in time. Ethan's scream, sharp and panicked, echoed through the valley before abruptly stopping. The sudden silence that followed was more terrifying than the fall itself. Lucas and Mia called for him, voices trembling, but only the echo of their own fear returned. In the chaos, Mia reached out to grab Ethan's arm, but the fog twisted around them, disorienting her. She stumbled, briefly losing her footing, and when she regained balance, she realized Lucas and Sophia were a step ahead, partially obscured by the mist. The trail that had been a single, narrow path now seemed like a labyrinth with multiple forks and dead ends. Jordan, moving cautiously to help Mia, realized with a jolt that the group's cohesion had fractured. They were scattered, each person isolated in the dense fog, reliant solely on instinct and memory to navigate. Panic set in fully now, sharp and consuming. The forest seemed alive, reacting to their fear, closing in, twisting familiar paths into something alien and dangerous. Every rustle, every whisper of wind, every distant echo felt like a signal that they were being observed, herded, tested. The once adventurous journey had become a fight to maintain connection, to avoid the invisible forces that seemed to shape the night around them. Lucas tried to regroup, calling out with increasing urgency, but the fog distorted his voice, sending it scattering into multiple directions. One by one, responses came, muffled, delayed, and confusing. The friends struggled to determine the location of one another, shouting names into the darkness that responded with nothing but uncertainty. Fear compounded as the minutes dragged on, the reality of separation settling like a weight on their shoulders. Yosemite, magnificent and serene in daylight, had revealed a harsher truth at night. Even the strongest bonds could be tested and fractured by the sheer scale and unpredictability of nature. By the time the moon rose high enough to cast weak silver light across the landscape, it was clear. The group had been splintered. Lucas could make out faint shadows in the fog, moving uncertainly and separately. He realized with sinking dread that they were no longer 5 friends moving together through the forest. They were individuals, isolated by distance, fear, and the deceptive paths of the wilderness. The forest held them in its grip, vast and silent. And as the night deepened, the first real step toward disappearance had begun. It was a night of confusion, fear, and relentless uncertainty. The friends had ventured into Yosemite seeking adventure, beauty, and camaraderie. Instead, they found themselves navigating a labyrinth of shadows and fog, where every step carried the risk of being lost. Every whisper of wind seemed to mock them, and every familiar landmark had been rendered alien. The forest, indifferent and enormous, had begun to claim its own narrative, and the five friends were now part of its unfolding mystery, each separated, each vulnerable, each facing the unknown in silence. The forest had become a maze of shadows and whispers, each tree and boulder distorted by the thick fog that blanketed Yosemite. The five friends, now scattered and disoriented, struggled to navigate the labyrinthine trails, calling out names into the void, only to have their voices swallowed by the night. Lucas, determined to locate the others, pressed forward cautiously, every step calculated, his ears straining for any sound that might indicate movement. Ethan stumbled along, guided more by instinct than sight. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a raw fear that made each decision feel critical. The forest seemed alive, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves magnified into a signal of imminent danger. He paused frequently, straining to hear over the pounding of his own heart, convinced that he was being watched. The isolation was unbearable, and yet he had no choice but to keep moving, following faint echoes that could be the others, or his imagination. Mia, camera abandoned, clutched a small flashlight, its weak beam barely piercing the fog. She moved cautiously, each step deliberate, searching for shadows that might be Lucas or Sophia or Jordan. She called out repeatedly, but the responses were inconsistent, sometimes delayed, sometimes distorted, as if the forest itself were playing with sound. Her heart raced as she realized the reality of their situation. The forest was vast, the paths confusing, and the night was merciless. Sophia, journal in hand, had stopped attempting to record observations, her mind entirely consumed by the urgency of survival. She had lost sight of everyone else and was moving in a direction she hoped would lead her back to the group. Every sound startled her, every movement in the fog set her on edge. She kept her breathing controlled, knowing that panic would only hinder her ability to navigate. Still, the creeping sense of being watched never left her. The forest felt sentient, vast and indifferent, and she wondered if the wilderness had always held this latent threat, simply waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Jordan, the steadfast protector, had fallen back slightly to check the path they had traveled, hoping to retrace steps and guide everyone back to the main trail. His strong presence had always been a comfort, but now he felt the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. Each unfamiliar turn, each shadow that seemed alive, reminded him of how quickly the wilderness could turn from breathtaking to unforgiving. The fog, thick and oppressive, seemed determined to disorient, separating them not just physically but mentally, eroding the confidence that had carried them this far. The friends' separation became painfully apparent when Lucas, after moving cautiously for what felt like hours, realized he was alone. His calls for the others were met with delayed or muffled responses, distorted by the fog and terrain. Panic threatened to rise, but he forced himself to stay calm, scanning the misty landscape for any movement. The forest around him was silent, yet alive, shadows stretching unnaturally, shapes shifting with the weak moonlight. Each decision, whether to move forward, backtrack, or stay put, felt weighted with consequence. Meanwhile, Ethan found himself at the edge of a steep incline, fog thick around him, the valley below obscured by shadows. He could hear faint shouts in the distance, but it was impossible to know if they were real or imagined. His pulse raced, but he knew he couldn't stop. Moving cautiously, he called out, trying to guide the others toward his position. The night air seemed to carry his voice unevenly, and every response was fragmented, teasing hope while deepening the sense of isolation. Mia stumbled upon a shallow stream, its water glinting silver in the weak light. She crouched to drink and gather her strength, realizing that exhaustion was as dangerous as the terrain itself. The fog shifted around her, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw Lucas's silhouette on the far bank. She called out, but the echo returned, strangely warped. She took a deep breath, focusing on moving toward the faint figure, though the fear of stepping off the path and into unseen danger made every movement cautious and tense. Sophia's path led her to an unfamiliar grove of trees, twisted and ancient. She paused, straining to hear the others, and thought she detected movement, a shadow flitting between the trunks. Her heart leapt, hope mingled with fear. She called their names, and a faint reply reached her ears. Encouraged, she began moving toward the sound, though each step felt perilous, the fog obscuring roots and rocks that could easily trip her. Jordan, retracing steps and scanning the trail, caught a glimpse of a faint light in the distance, perhaps a flashlight from one of the others. Relief surged through him, tempered by the knowledge that distance could betray them at any moment. He moved toward the light cautiously, calling out, hoping that the fragile thread of their connection could be restored. The fog twisted, hiding and revealing the path unpredictably, as if the forest itself were testing their resolve. By the time the first hints of dawn began to lighten the fog, the friends were exhausted, chilled, and more aware than ever of how vulnerable they were. The night had stretched endlessly, and the forest had proven both majestic and merciless. Each of them had confronted the terrifying reality that Yosemite, while beautiful, was vast, mysterious, and capable of swallowing even the most prepared hikers. The struggle to find each other continued, their voices strained, their hearts heavy, the boundaries of fear and perseverance pushed to their limits. In the eerie quiet of early morning, the 5 friends were still dispersed, each moving with care, each relying on intuition and hope. Yosemite, magnificent in daylight and haunting in shadow, had transformed the adventure into a test of endurance, courage, and the bonds of friendship. The night had changed them. It had revealed the forest not just as a place of beauty, but as a living force, vast and indifferent, and in its depths they were all painfully aware of how small and fragile they truly were. The first light of dawn began to seep through the dense canopy of Yosemite, casting a pale, trembling glow over the fog-laden forest. The night had been merciless, a relentless test of endurance and nerve, and the 5 friends had been pushed to the brink. The separation, the fear, and the disorienting terrain had left them each exhausted and shaken. Yet something in the softening light offered a fragile glimmer of hope. Lucas pressed forward cautiously, his eyes scanning the shifting shadows. The echoes of the night still lingered in his mind, the strange sounds, the unseen movements, the moments when it had seemed the forest itself was alive with intent. Yet as the dawn grew brighter, he began to detect subtle signs of his friends. A snapped branch that had been tripped recently, footprints in the damp soil, and the faint glimmer of Mia's flashlight beam in the distance. Each sign strengthened his resolve, a tangible thread linking him to the others, despite the vastness and unpredictability of the wilderness. Ethan, having navigated the treacherous incline the night before, stumbled upon a small clearing bathed in soft morning light. Relief surged through him as he caught sight of Mia across the fog, her figure emerging like a beacon. Their voices met in unison, strained yet filled with recognition, calling to one another across the clearing. The sound carried unusually well in the crisp morning air, cutting through the residual fog that had seemed so impenetrable during the night. Mia moved toward Ethan, her steps careful but swift, her earlier fear tempered by the joy of connection. The fog seemed to recede gradually, lifting like a veil, as if granting passage and clarity. Her eyes searched the forest eagerly for Lucas, Sophia, and Jordan, whose presence she desperately needed to feel complete once more. The interplay of shadow and light, once threatening, now seemed to guide her steps, revealing paths that had been hidden in darkness. Sophia, still clutching her journal, had discovered a faint trail marked by footprints and broken branches. Following them, with careful, deliberate steps, she began to hear distant voices, Lucas calling her name, Jordan shouting from another path. Her pace quickened, heart pounding, as the realization that they were reassembling brought both relief and a renewed sense of urgency. Yosemite, for all its danger and mystery, was offering them a path forward, a tenuous bridge, back to safety. Jordan had retraced his steps with methodical precision, checking every bend, ridge, and stream crossing. The first glimmers of morning light revealed the subtle contours of the landscape, making it easier to navigate. He called out, his voice carrying more steadily than it had in the night, and responses began to trickle back in fragmented but discernible forms. Slowly, cautiously, the friends began to converge, each step toward one another, imbued with both exhaustion and a profound sense of relief. By mid-morning, the fog had lifted completely, unveiling the grandeur of Yosemite in stark, beautiful clarity. The five friends finally stood together in a small clearing, huddled and weary, but alive. The ordeal of the night had left its mark, clothing torn, faces smeared with mud, hands scratched, but their shared survival reinforced the bonds that had been tested to the edge. They exchanged words, laughter, and tears, the tension of fear gradually yielding to the warmth of human connection. Though reunited, the memory of the night lingered. Each friend carried the silent acknowledgement that Yosemite's wilderness was both awe-inspiring and merciless. The forest, with its towering cliffs, dense fog, and hidden paths, had tested them individually and collectively. They understood in a quiet and unspoken way that the mystery of the night, the strange sounds, the disorienting fog, and the feeling of being watched would remain with them forever. Yosemite had claimed their attention, reshaped their perception, and reminded them of the fragility and resilience of the human spirit. As they made their way back toward the main trail, the morning light illuminated the valley in breathtaking clarity. Birds began to stir, streams sparkled, and the wind whispered gently through the trees. The friends moved slowly, savoring the normalcy of sunlight and visibility after a night of fear and uncertainty. Though the mystery of the previous hours could not be fully explained, the experience had left them changed, acutely aware of the power of nature and the strength that arises when human connection endures in the face of danger. By the time they emerged from the dense forest into the open expanse of Yosemite Valley, the ordeal had reached its conclusion. They were exhausted, bruised, and forever marked by the night, yet alive and profoundly grateful. The mystery of their disappearance lingered in memory and conversation, a story they would tell with reverence for the forest that had both threatened and sustained them. Yosemite had tested them, but it had also allowed them to survive, teaching lessons about vigilance, unity, and the fragile balance between humanity and the vast, indifferent wilderness. As they sat on a sunlit rock, catching their breath and gazing at the towering cliffs above, a quiet understanding passed among them. Adventure in Yosemite came with risk, beauty with challenge, and survival with humility. The night's terror had ended, but the story, the memory of being lost, of separation, and of ultimate reunion would remain forever, a testament to courage, resilience, and the enduring bond of friendship forged in the heart of the wilderness. If you were captivated by the mysterious disappearance of these 5 hikers in Yosemite, make sure to hit like and subscribe to our channel for more incredible survival stories and real-life mysteries. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in their place? Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an adventure that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Join our community of explorers and thrill seekers and help us uncover the untold secrets of the world, one story at a time.